I'm here at CrossFit Boston with James Hobart. We're going to take you through the back squat today, and we're going to focus on two variations, the high bar back squat and the low bar back squat. We're going to take you through the difference between the two and help you find the variation that's more suitable for your training. You may find that it's both, you may find that it's the high bar, you may find that it's the low bar. But we're going to start with the low bar back squat, which many of you will recognize as the Rippetoe variation of that squat. James, let's go ahead and get that done. When he racks the bar, he's going to rack it here on the shelf created by his shoulders. He doesn't have his thumb around the bar. Come on back. And James, actually, if you could turn 90 degrees to face the windows here. We're just going to take a look at this shelf created by his scapula. With the elbows elevated, it gives us a nice place to put that bar, and it's not going to slide down at all. When James takes his squat, it may be slightly wider than his normal squat stance, just outside shoulder width, and he's going to have his toes turned out. Turn back 90 degrees for me, buddy. Good. Once we have this rack position established, he's going to initiate this squat by sending the hip back and down. And this is really the defining feature of the low bar back squat. We're loading that posterior chain, the glutes and hamstrings, and using that loaded hip, that loaded posterior chain, to drive the load up. So sit back and down for me, James. And you'll notice that like any squat, the bar has to stay directly over the top of his foot, right over the middle of his foot, I should say, and that necessitates that his torso leans over. When he comes out of this squat, the hip drives up, and then the hip extends. Okay? The fact that he's leaning over and putting this bar lower on his back is going to give him an advantage in moving load, especially combined with the fact that we're loading that hip over the high bar back squat. Let's take a look at that again. When he sits back and down, the distance between the point of rotation, his hip, and this bar is fairly small. And it's small because he's placed it low on his back and he's bent over to put them closer together. Go ahead and drive up. That's going to give him a mechanical advantage. Combine the fact that the hip extensors, the glute and the hamstring, are the primary movers here. He's going to be able to move a lot of load. He's giving up some uprightness of his torso. You'll notice again as he goes into the bottom and leans forward to keep that bar stacked over the middle of his foot that the torso's at this angle, but the load's essentially compressing straight down like this. As that load goes straight down, it's not putting the spine into compression, its natural function, but rather into rotation. And so he's fighting this shear, the tendency of this bar to push him forward and down, by picking up his chest and using the erector series to keep that super tight. Go ahead and stand up and walk it in. Now it's worth noting that all of the salient features of the squat are going to be followed in both the high bar and low bar variations. His weight is going to be primarily on his heel. Okay? The bar is always going to be over the center of the foot. We're always going to be in extension with the chest up and the lower lumbar arch, and the knees are always going to track the toes. This bar position and the position of the torso are really what's going to define the differences here. So let's go ahead and take a look now at the high bar back squat. Rather than place the bar on that shelf, James is going to put the bar now up on his traps. And James, go ahead and unrack that. Come on out and 90 degrees towards the window for me. So we'll see that in this version, the bar's up on his traps rather than down here on the shelf created by the scapula. His thumb is around the bar rather than on top of it, and this is just a function of the fact that it's not uncomfortable to do so. He no longer has to wrap the thumb over the top to wedge the bar into his back. Go ahead and turn back for me, James. And we'll see that when he squats in this version, he's going to be much more upright. Because the bar isn't low on his back, it can stay there. He can stay upright, and it will still remain over the middle of his foot. Okay? So James, go ahead and descend for me here. We'll see that we've got a very upright posture. We've still got that lower lumbar arch. We've still got the knees tracking the toes. But one thing you'll also notice is that the knee has now traveled forward quite a bit more than it did in the low bar back squat. This is going to place the emphasis on the knee as the primary mover, as the extender of this squat, and therefore going to place most of the load on his quads. Go ahead and drive up. So in the high bar back squat, we're talking about a quad dominant squat, where in the low bar back squat, we're talking about a hamstring glute dominant squat. Obviously, these bigger muscles in the posterior chain are able to move more load. So in getting this upright torso, James is compromising the amount of load he's going to be able to move. Why would he do that? Well, as far as transferability to the Olympic lifts, this is exactly what we want. Go ahead and go down for me. In the low bar back squat, you saw his torso pitch forward. You saw that weight going straight down and putting the spine essentially into rotation. Here, we can see that the primary vector of gravity is going to be straight down through his spine. It's going to give us a compressive force. And so that spine's now performing its natural function, which is in compression, those discs taking that force. And he's able to, with all of his body stacked under this, drive straight up. The more of James that's stacked under the bar, the easier time he's going to have lifting in a vertical pattern. This makes sense when we start talking about the pull of the clean, the catch of the clean, and the snatch, where that vertical torso having the spine in compression is absolutely essential. And we can actually demonstrate this probably most vividly by moving away from the back squat and towards the overhead squat. So James, do this for me. Go ahead and go out to your snatch grip. Drive that bar up. Okay. And now do your normal overhead squat. Okay, and stay on the bottom for me. So we'll see here that James hasn't leaned his torso forward. There's some space under the bar, but we're primarily taking that load through compressive force of the spine and the shoulders being elevated. If James were to shift into a posterior dominant squat, come up about 3 inches, James, stick your ass back and push your torso forward, and now push down into a low bar back squat position. Good, uncomfortable as hell. There's barely anything holding this bar up other than his shoulders. There's air under his chest. There's air under the bar. Come on up. Come on up. All right, relax, brother. Relax. How'd that feel? Nice. Yeah, it sucks. Okay? So the second we start talking about doing a high bar versus a low bar back squat, we're talking about applicability, of being able to move that to the snatch and clean and jerk. Now, if you want to move max load, if your only concern is optimizing the strength of the posterior chain, the glutes and hamstrings, that low bar back squat's your baby. Okay? If we're talking about compromising some of the force that you're able to generate in a squat in service of maintaining an upright torso and keeping the spine in compression for the Olympic lifts, we want to do that high bar version. Okay? Now, you're going to find, especially as a CrossFitter, that a lot of things that we do are going to work the posterior chain hard. Okay? Deadlifts, cleans, it's all going to be in the back seat. And you may have even heard quad dominance referred to as a bad thing in CrossFit. We see folks coming off the street with running backgrounds, especially spend all their time on the field, on their toes, being very quad dominant. We do a great job of balancing that out through posterior chain exercises. You want to be careful that over the years that you don't become posterior chain dominant any more than you want to be quad dominant, like those runners are coming off the streets. So it may make sense, if you're a long-term CrossFitter with a strong posterior chain, to go ahead and allow some of that load to be borne by the knee extensors, to be borne by those quads, by doing that high bar variation. So again, there are 2 ways to look at that, but you want to pick the one that's best for your needs. James, let's just recap the salient features of both of those real fast so we make sure everybody's got their form correct. We'll start with a low bar back squat. Good, come on out and turn 90 degrees. When we're looking at the top of the low bar back squat, the bar is on the spine of the scapula. The thumb is over the top and the elbows are flared back to create a shelf for the bar. Okay, 90 degrees. The initiation of the squat is done by sending the hip back and down, with the knees tracking the toes and the posterior chain loaded. Note that the knee does not travel forward in front of the toe tremendously, and most of the load here is being borne by the hamstrings. James drives up with the hip first, okay, and then extends the torso. You'll see that hip come and then the torso come up. One more time at speed, James. Down, we see that hip bounce, the hip comes first, and James comes up, and that's a picture-perfect variation. Go ahead and rack it. And now the cues for the high bar back squat, rather than have the thumb over the top, James is going to go ahead and grip the bar. He's going to place the bar on his traps rather than the spine of the scapula. When we have that variation, we're also going to initiate by sending the hip back just ever so slightly, but you're essentially going to see compression as he sits down. you'll see that the knees necessarily travel forward more. This is going to put most of the load on the anterior rather than the posterior, on the quads rather than the hamstrings. And as he drives up, that quad bears more of the responsibility for the movement. Go ahead and rack it, James. Is one better than the other? Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. But hopefully now you have the tools to perform both the high bar and low bar back squat adequately, and you know which situations you should apply both.